5 True Scary Stories for Halloween. Unveil the Whispering Shadows. There are stories that linger in the dark corners of our minds, tales told with lowered voices and a shared glance over the shoulder, as though just the act of remembering could awaken something best left forgotten. Tonight, as the last orange glow of dusk fades and Halloween unfurls its long shadows, I'm here to share 3 such tales with you. They are not mere stories. They are warnings, testimonies to the hidden, restless things that wake when we tread too close to their forgotten domains. Imagine an old neighborhood, tucked away just beyond the reach of streetlights, where homes creak under the weight of years and secrets cling to every corner. This place, cloaked in rustling leaves and shadows that stretch with a mind of their own, has its own tales to tell. Here, they whisper of a haunted mirror that steals glimpses of the soul, showing reflections that linger a beat too long, as if there's something trapped on the other side. Or shadows that come alive, flitting just out of view but always watching, waiting for the next unwitting soul who dares to cross their path. Then there's the graveyard, the old one, hidden by gnarled trees and often forgotten by those who don't already know its secrets. It sits silent, cloaked in ivy and fog, a place where spirits are said to never rest. Some claim that on Halloween night, the souls beneath that earth begin to stir, eager for a chance to walk among the living once more. And those who tread near, especially those brave or foolish enough to linger past midnight, are said to be marked, chosen to carry the graveyard's curse long after they leave. Each story I tell tonight has been whispered about for years, passed down by those who dared listen and survived long enough to warn others. These tales have become legends, but they're woven from threads of truth, stitched together by the very real fear of those who lived through them. The mirror, the shadows, the graveyard, they're not just tales to send shivers down your spine. No, these stories are reminders, omens left behind by those who have seen what most never will, and live to warn the rest of us. So listen carefully, but be wary. Sometimes even the act of listening, of opening your mind to the impossible, invites in the things that lie just beyond the veil. Halloween is a thin night, they say, when the supernatural lurks close to our world. And tonight, as you lean into these stories, remember, once you've heard them, there's no turning back. What you hear cannot be unheard. And somewhere in the shadows, someone or something is listening back. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. It was Halloween night, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and the sharp bite of approaching winter. Mark and his friends huddled in the middle of the old, overgrown yard, looking up at the abandoned house that loomed over them like a menacing shadow. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but Mark wasn't buying it. He was the skeptic of the group, always the one to rationalize the unexplainable, and tonight he was determined to prove to everyone that the stories were nothing more than campfire tales designed to scare gullible kids. "Come on," he scoffed, forcing a grin as he glanced at his friends. "It's just an old house. There's no such thing as haunted." His best friend Sam shuffled nervously, glancing at the windows as if half expecting to see someone, or something, peering back at him. "Yeah, well, you heard the stories, right? They say if you spend the night in there, you'll hear voices calling your name. And some people say they've seen shadows that look like people who, used to live here." Mark rolled his eyes. Probably just creaky floorboards and dust playing tricks on people. "Let's go prove it." With flashlights in hand, they crossed the threshold into the house. The wooden floor groaned beneath their feet as they moved, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. Mark swept his flashlight around the room, illuminating broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs that hung like gauzy curtains. The silence was palpable, thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. For a while, nothing happened. They moved through the rooms, laughing at each other's jumpy reactions, but even Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. It was a sensation that crept up on him gradually, starting as a vague itch in the back of his mind and growing until he couldn't ignore it. The air felt charged, electric, and every now and then he thought he caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Then, suddenly, a faint whisper drifted through the air, barely audible but unmistakable. "Mark?" He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was soft, almost gentle, and yet it sent a chill racing down his spine. He looked at his friends, expecting to see someone snickering, but they all had the same wide-eyed, horrified expressions. What was that?" Sam stammered, his face pale. Mark swallowed, trying to regain his composure. "It's probably just, I don't know, wind or something. This place is old. Let's keep moving." But as they continued, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls and filling the empty rooms with a sinister presence. The voices called each of their names in turn, and no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, the words seemed to burrow into their minds, filling them with a growing sense of dread. Mark's rational explanations began to falter as he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. Shadows moved along the walls, shifting and coiling like living things. One shadow, in particular, seemed to be following him, moving just out of the range of his flashlight. It was darker than the others, almost solid, and it had a shape that looked eerily familiar. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat as the shadow stepped out of the darkness and took on a human form. It was him. The shadow wore his face, his clothes, his expression, but its eyes were hollow. Empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. It lifted a hand, beckoning him closer, and its lips parted to form a single word. "Come closer." Mark stumbled back, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, the shadow stood there, waiting, as though it had all the time in the world. "Mark," it whispered again, the voice dripping with malice. "Come closer." Mark's legs felt like lead, his body frozen with terror as the shadow continued to beckon. His friends called his name, their voices barely breaking through the haze of fear that clouded his mind. But he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the dark figure that mirrored his own image. "Mark!" Sam shouted, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "Snap out of it!" The touch jolted him back to reality, and he blinked, the shadow vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. He gasped, his heart pounding as he looked around the room, half expecting the shadow to reappear. But there was nothing there, only the silent, empty house. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Shadows swirled around them, twisting and writhing, each one taking on a vaguely human shape. They moved closer, closing in on them, and Mark could feel the weight of their gaze. 1,000 empty eyes watching him with a hunger that defied comprehension. They ran, stumbling through the darkened halls, the whispers growing louder with each step. The shadows followed them, slipping through cracks and around corners, always just a step behind. Mark could feel them reaching for him, cold fingers brushing against his skin, pulling him back. Finally, they burst through the front door and out into the night, gasping for breath. The silence outside was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. They looked back at the house, half expecting to see the shadows lurking in the windows, but the place was silent and still, as though nothing had happened. Mark's hands were trembling, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The rational explanations he had clung to so tightly seemed laughable now, shattered by the experience he could barely bring himself to believe. But as they walked away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. The shadows had seen him, recognized him, and he knew, deep down, that they would be back. Halloween had lifted the veil, and now that they had crossed into the shadows' domain, there was no going back. As they reached the edge of the neighborhood, a faint whisper drifted through the air, barely audible but unmistakable. "Mark." And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he and his friends rushed through the darkened halls of the abandoned house, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They had reached the front door, ready to burst out into the night and leave this nightmare behind, until they were stopped in their tracks. The shadows had shifted. Black tendrils of darkness reached across the door, twisting and blocking the only exit. Everywhere they looked, the shadows coiled, bending and stretching like sinister vines, moving as though alive. The friends were trapped, and a chilling realization dawned on each of them. The house did not want them to leave. "Mark," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "It's like they're waiting." The room was filled with an eerie, bone-chilling quiet, broken only by the soft sound of whispers. At first, they couldn't make out the words, just faint murmurs that danced around them like a mocking lullaby. But gradually, the voices grew louder, and each of them began to hear something different, something personal. One voice murmured to Sam about his deepest fear, a secret he'd never told anyone. Another whispered to Julie about the guilt she carried from her childhood. The shadows knew things about them, things no one else could have known. Their deepest insecurities, hidden fears, and buried memories were being plucked from their minds and spoken aloud. "Stop it," Sam yelled, clutching his head as if trying to block out the words. But the voices persisted, growing in intensity until it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on them, smothering them with their own secrets. Mark's heart pounded as he tried to shut out the words, but one voice cut through the noise, piercing his thoughts like an icy blade. It was different from the others, soft and pleading, filled with despair. "Help me," it whispered. "Please, don't leave me here." Mark's gaze darted to a corner of the room, where a figure began to take shape, materializing from the shadows. It was the silhouette of a young boy, his small form trembling, eyes wide with fear. Mark recognized him immediately. The boy looked like Tom Walters, the child who had vanished from this neighborhood years ago. There had been search parties, rumors, whispered suspicions about what had happened to him, but no one had ever found him. Now here he was, his shadowy form flickering like a dying flame. The boy's shadow extended a hand, beckoning Mark closer. "Please," the boy's voice trembled. "They won't let me go. They won't let any of us go." The revelation struck Mark like a punch to the gut. The shadows, they weren't just shapes. They were people, trapped here, their spirits confined to this wretched place. And now they wanted more. The boy's shadow looked directly at Mark, his eyes filled with a hollow desperation. "If you don't get out," the boy whispered, his voice barely a breath, "they'll keep you too, forever." Mark felt a wave of nausea as he realized what the boy was saying. These shadows, they were hungry, desperate for company, for anyone who would join them in their endless silent suffering. And if they didn't escape, they would become part of this cursed place, their shadows lost among the others. "Run!" Mark shouted, breaking from his frozen stupor and grabbing Sam and Julie by their arms. "We have to find another way out." They scrambled down the hallway, desperately searching for another door, a window, any way out. But every exit was blocked by shadows, the darkness shifting and contorting to prevent their escape. The house seemed alive, as though it had its own sinister intentions, keeping them within its walls and feeding on their fear. A high-pitched wail pierced the air, a scream of pure terror that reverberated through the house. It was Julie. She had stumbled, falling behind, and now the shadows were reaching for her, their inky tendrils curling around her legs, pulling her back toward the darkness. "Mark!" she screamed, her voice choked with terror. "Help me!" Mark lunged forward, grabbing her hand and pulling her with all his strength. The shadows seemed to resist, tugging her back, but with one last desperate effort, he managed to pull her free. They ran, hearts pounding, their fear driving them forward as the shadows closed in from all sides. Finally, they reached an old, narrow window at the back of the house, half hidden behind tattered curtains and cobwebs. Mark wasted no time, grabbing a nearby chair and smashing it against the glass until it shattered. The three of them scrambled through the window, cutting themselves on the broken glass, but not caring in the slightest. They tumbled out into the cold night, gasping for air, their hearts racing as they sprinted away from the house. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the neighborhood, where they finally collapsed, panting and trembling. Did that just happen?" Sam asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. They were too shaken, too horrified to speak. They had escaped, but the memory of the shadows, the whispering voices, lingered in their minds like a dark cloud. The next morning, Mark woke up feeling drained, haunted by fragments of the previous night. But he forced himself to shake it off. He was safe. They were all safe. That was what mattered. As he got ready, he heard his phone buzz with a message from Sam. "Hey Mark, Julie and I went back to the house. She thought she dropped her wallet in the rush last night. Mark's blood ran cold. Back to the house? He thought, horror creeping up his spine. He called Sam immediately, but there was no answer. Hours passed, and Mark's anxiety grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that his friends were still trapped in that nightmare. Finally, Sam called back. His voice was subdued, barely a whisper. We found her wallet, he said. But something happened. Mark listened, his stomach twisting as Sam recounted their experience. They had found the wallet, but as they had stepped back into the house, the shadows had returned, whispering in the darkness, filling their minds with voices that weren't their own. The next thing they knew, they were outside, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. Only vague, nightmarish flashes of shadows reaching for them, pulling them down into endless darkness. Mark, Sam whispered, they said our names. They told us we couldn't leave. Mark didn't answer, too horrified to speak. He knew, as he stared at his own shadows stretching across the ground, that they hadn't truly escaped. The shadows had marked them, and now there was no way to erase the stain of that night. And as the autumn sun dipped below the horizon, the last of the day's light faded, leaving only darkness behind. Shadows stretched long and deep across the ground, whispering their secrets, waiting. Story 2: The Cursed Mirror. The sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the thrift store, illuminating a world filled with forgotten treasures and hidden stories. It was Halloween afternoon, and Linda was on a mission to find decorations for her family's annual Halloween party. She scoured the aisles, her fingers brushing against cobweb-covered ornaments and tattered costumes. It was a quaint little shop, the kind that felt more like a museum than a store, and that filled with relics of the past. As she turned a corner, something caught her eye. A large antique mirror tucked away in a dark corner, almost as if it were trying to hide from the world. The frame was intricately carved, embellished with swirling designs that whispered of old-world elegance. It felt alive, the glass shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Linda approached the mirror, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Just as she reached out to touch the cool surface, the store owner appeared beside her, his voice raspy yet filled with urgency. "Be careful with that one, ma'am," he warned, his eyes narrowing. "It has a history. You need to use it wisely." "History?" Linda echoed, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The owner hesitated, casting a wary glance at the mirror before replying. "It's said to show things that shouldn't be seen. Just use it carefully." With a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, Linda purchased the mirror, laughing off the store owner's ominous words. After all, it was just an old piece of glass, right? She imagined it would add a touch of vintage charm to her Halloween decorations. Once home, Linda placed the mirror in the living room, admiring how it reflected the warm glow of the autumn sun filtering through the windows. As she decorated the house, she caught glimpses of her reflection in the mirror, but something felt off. Every now and then, she noticed a flicker of movement behind her, an indistinct shadow that vanished the moment she turned around. "Mom!" Her son Timmy called from the other room, his voice tinged with excitement. "Look at this!" Linda rushed to find him, momentarily shaking off the unsettling feeling. Timmy was standing in front of the mirror, wide-eyed and pointing. "There's an old man in there," he exclaimed, bouncing on his heels. "He's looking at me." "What are you talking about, Timmy?" Linda laughed, kneeling beside him. "There's no one there." But as she gazed into the mirror, her smile faded. She saw a shadowy figure, a gaunt old man with hollow eyes staring back at her from the depths of the glass. He was gone in an instant, replaced by her own reflection. The feeling of unease returned, settling like a stone in her stomach. "Mom, he's right there. He's scary," Timmy insisted, his voice trembling. Linda's heart raced as she forced a smile, brushing it off as a child's overactive imagination. "It's just a trick of the light, sweetie. Mirrors can play funny games sometimes." Yet, that night, as the family gathered for dinner, the tension in the air thickened. Linda's husband, Dave, glanced nervously at the mirror every time he passed it. "Did you really think that thing was a good idea?" he asked, concern etching his features. "What did that guy mean by history?" Linda rolled her eyes, dismissing his worries. "It's just a mirror, Dave. Besides, it looks great in here." But the unease gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held secrets, dark and hidden. Later that night, while preparing for bed, she passed by the mirror once more, and this time, the shadow was back, much clearer than before. The old man stood behind her, a faint smile curling on his lips. His presence was both haunting and mesmerizing. "Why won't you just go away?" she whispered, trying to ignore the chill creeping down her spine. She turned abruptly, but there was nothing behind her, only the empty hallway stretching into darkness. As the days passed, strange occurrences began to plague the household. Each family member experienced bizarre reflections in the cursed mirror. Timmy swore he saw the old man waving, while Dave claimed he witnessed flashes of his own past, moments he'd rather forget. Linda herself began seeing glimpses of tragic events, warnings of things that hadn't yet happened but felt all too real. One evening, while Linda was tidying up, she caught sight of the mirror again. This time, she saw a reflection that sent chills down her spine. A vision of Timmy slipping and falling down the stairs, blood pooling around him. The horrific image struck her like lightning, and her heart raced with fear. "Timmy!" she shouted, rushing to the staircase. She found him playing at the top, oblivious to the danger. She snatched his arm, pulling him away just as he stumbled. "You have to be careful, sweetie." "What's wrong, Mom?" Timmy asked, his eyes wide with confusion. "Just nothing. Just stay close to me," Linda stammered, her heart still racing. She glanced back at the mirror, her breath hitching in her throat. The old man's shadow loomed larger, and he seemed to be watching her every move. Over the next few days, the reflections grew more sinister. Linda witnessed scenes of tragedy, a car crash, a house fire, an accident at a nearby construction site, all events that had yet to occur. Each time, she tried to warn her family, but they brushed it off as mere coincidence, blaming the stress of preparing for the Halloween party. "Mom, it's just a mirror," Dave said dismissively one night as they decorated the front porch. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She felt the weight of the mirror's gaze, its reflections growing darker and more chaotic. Finally, on Halloween night, everything came to a head. Linda decided to host a small gathering with friends, hoping to distract herself from the mirror's haunting presence. As the doorbell rang and guests began to arrive, a sense of normalcy washed over her, until the lights flickered. The moment the power surged back, Linda glanced at the mirror, and her breath caught in her throat. The old man stood there, no longer shadowy, but solid and defined. His expression twisted into a snarl, eyes burning with malevolence. "Leave while you can," he hissed, his voice echoing through the room. "They are coming." Linda's heart raced as her friends began to notice the shift in the atmosphere. Laughter faded, replaced by uneasy glances toward the mirror. She could sense their confusion, but the fear coursing through her veins paralyzed her. "What's wrong?" one friend asked, glancing nervously at Linda. "The mirror, it's not just a mirror." Linda finally managed to stammer, pointing at the cursed object. "It shows what's coming. It shows what's wrong." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. Gasps erupted from her friends as they scrambled for their phones, illuminating their faces with harsh beams of light. In the dim glow, the mirror shone brighter than ever, reflecting a scene of chaos. The old man now stood at the center of the mirror, surrounded by a swirling vortex of shadowy figures, all reaching out as if trying to break free. "They will take you all," he warned, his voice now a menacing growl. "The mirror has chosen you." Panic erupted in the room as Linda's friends backed away, horrified. She could see it now. The shadows were not just reflections, they were a gateway, a portal to something dark and insatiable. They were hungry, and the mirror had fed them, beckoning them in. "Get away from the mirror," Linda shouted, grabbing Timmy's hand and pulling him away. "We have to leave. Now." But the shadows surged forth, breaking free from the mirror's confines, sweeping through the room like a dark tide. Linda could hear their whispers, their voices growing louder, calling out to each guest, searching for new souls to claim. "Run!" she cried, her heart pounding as she led Timmy toward the front door. But as they neared the exit, the shadows reached for them, wrapping around her legs like cold fingers. Just as Linda felt herself being pulled back, she summoned every ounce of strength she had. "No," she screamed, yanking Timmy free. "We have to go." With a final, desperate push, they burst through the door and into the cool night air. Behind them, the shadows shrieked in frustration, retreating back into the cursed mirror. But the old man's face remained, his eyes boring into Linda, a chilling reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. They stumbled into the street, breathless and shaken. Linda glanced back at the house, her heart heavy with dread. "We have to destroy it," she whispered to Timmy, who looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "We can't let anyone else fall victim to it." The next day, with the help of Dave and a few trusted friends, they returned to the thrift store, the cursed mirror still lingering in their minds. Linda approached the store owner, her heart pounding. "We need to get rid of that mirror," she said firmly. "It's dangerous." The store owner's face paled. "I warned you," he murmured, guilt written across his features. "I didn't think you would bring it back. It has a way of clinging to those it has touched." Linda's resolve hardened. "Then we'll do whatever it takes to destroy it." That evening, they gathered at the park, a safe distance from their home. With the mirror shrouded in blankets, Linda stood in front of her friends, her heart racing. "On the count of 3, she said, holding a hammer in her trembling hands. "We'll smash it together. 1, 2, 3. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the air, a cacophony of release. As the mirror splintered into 1,000 pieces, the old man's face twisted in rage, but then faded into nothingness. The shadows dissipated, their hold over Linda and her family finally broken. They stood in silence, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the darkness lift. Linda hugged Timmy close, tears of relief streaming down her face. But deep down, a lingering question remained. Had they truly destroyed it, or had they only delayed the inevitable? Would the mirror find its way back into someone else's hands, seeking new victims to ensnare? Only time would tell, but for now, they were free. As they walked home hand in hand, Linda vowed never to forget the lesson learned. Some reflections are better left unseen. The days turned into weeks after the Halloween party, and Linda tried to move on from the terrifying experience with the cursed mirror. But even as the festive decorations came down, she felt an unshakable weight in her chest. The mirror stood in the corner of the living room, covered with a sheet, yet its presence loomed over her like a dark cloud. Despite her fears, Linda couldn't help but glance at it whenever she passed by. The reflections it held felt like a distant echo, a memory she couldn't quite grasp, but one that continually tugged at her mind. Sometimes she could swear she heard faint whispers, shadows of laughter or cries that seemed to seep through the very walls of their home. One night, exhaustion washed over her, and she found herself drawn to the mirror despite the warnings echoing in her mind. She pulled the sheet away, revealing the cracked surface, each fissure a jagged reminder of its malevolence. As she gazed into the glass, her breath caught in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she saw herself, but something was terribly wrong. The reflection was distorted, her features warped into a sinister grin that stretched wider than any human face should. It was as if the mirror had twisted her essence, trapping her soul within its glassy prison. "Linda?" a voice whispered, chilling and soft, like a breeze that danced through the room. "You'll be next." Her heart raced as panic coursed through her veins. "What do you mean?" she gasped, stepping back, but the reflection only grinned wider, its eyes glimmering with a dark glee that sent shivers down her spine. Desperation washed over her, and she stumbled back into the hallway, her mind racing. How could she have thought the mirror was just an antique? How could she have dismissed the store owner's warnings? She felt the weight of the old man's eyes in the mirror, their haunting stare pinning her in place. The voice continued to echo in her mind, a relentless reminder of the danger that lay within that cursed glass. "Dave!" she cried, running to find her husband. She found him sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the television, completely absorbed in a show. "We need to talk about the mirror. It's not just a decoration, it's dangerous." "Linda, not this again," Dave said, his voice weary. "You're letting this get to your head. It's just an old piece of furniture. There's no such thing as curses or spirits." "But I saw," she began, but he cut her off, his tone firm. "It's Halloween, Linda. It's all in your head. You're just stressed. We have so much going on with the kids and work." He waved a hand dismissively. "We can't waste time worrying about a mirror." Frustrated, Linda felt tears prick at her eyes. "You don't understand. It's not just a mirror. It shows the future, Dave. It showed me something terrible." "Okay, let's say it did," he replied, his brow furrowed. "You can't just throw it out. It might be valuable." "Valuable?" she repeated incredulously. "It's a curse. Can't you see that?" Dave sighed, clearly irritated. "You're overreacting. Just leave it alone, all right?" His refusal to acknowledge her fears only fueled her panic. Linda's heart raced as she returned to the living room, her resolve hardening. She couldn't just stand by and let the mirror control their lives. That night, sleep eluded her. Linda lay awake, listening to the whispers that seemed to rise from the very walls of their home. Shadows danced on the edges of her vision, and she could feel the mirror calling to her, pulling her closer into its dark grasp. When the clock struck midnight, she finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. She crept downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The moonlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the sheet-covered mirror like a beacon in the darkness. With trembling hands, she pulled the sheet away, revealing the twisted visage within. As she stared into the glass, the sinister grin returned, its mocking laughter echoing in her mind. "You'll be next," it whispered again, a taunt laced with dark promise. In that moment of sheer terror, Linda felt a surge of adrenaline. She couldn't let this thing have power over her family any longer. She reached for the hammer she had hidden in the garage earlier that day, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal with determination. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty house. "I won't let you take anyone else." With all her might, she swung the hammer against the mirror's surface. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, fragments scattering across the floor like fallen stars. But as the pieces flew, Linda gasped in horror. Each shard reflected not only her actions, but also dark, twisted visions of herself trapped within. She could see herself screaming, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break free. The echoes of her voice resonated through the room, a cacophony of despair that sent chills down her spine. "No," she cried, stumbling back as the shards began to pulse with energy, their reflections shimmering ominously. Each broken piece seemed to whisper her name, urging her to succumb to the darkness within. Linda felt herself teetering on the brink of oblivion, as if the glass wanted to pull her in, to trap her forever in its grasp. Desperate, she stumbled backward, but before she could escape, the shards began to tremble, drawing closer together as if forming a sinister tapestry of her fate. "Linda," they echoed, a chilling chorus of her own voice. "You belong to us now." Panicking, she turned to run, but the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her back toward the remnants of the mirror. "Help! Dave!" she screamed, but her cries echoed hollowly in the night, swallowed by the darkness. When Dave finally heard the commotion, he rushed to the living room, only to find the shattered pieces glimmering ominously on the floor. The mirror was destroyed, but Linda was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through him as he searched the house, calling her name, his heart pounding in his chest. "Linda!" he shouted, his voice rising in desperation. "Where are you?" But there was only silence, punctuated by the haunting whispers of the broken glass. The reflections seemed to shift and change, revealing glimpses of Linda trapped within, a distorted figure pressing against the shards, her eyes wide with terror. "Dave?" the shards echoed, a broken plea that cut through him like a knife. He felt a chill creep down his spine as he realized the truth. She was gone. The mirror had claimed her, and now all that remained were the echoes of her voice, forever trapped in a world of shattered visions. Days turned into weeks as the family struggled to cope with Linda's disappearance. The children were left in a state of confusion, haunted by dreams of their mother calling out to them from beyond the veil of the unknown. Each night, they would stand before the remnants of the mirror, searching for any sign of her, but all they found were distorted reflections of their own grief. Dave, consumed by guilt, scoured the town for answers, returning to the thrift store where Linda had found the mirror. The store owner was gone, leaving behind only a fading memory of the warnings he had given. Frustrated, Dave sank into despair, knowing he had dismissed Linda's fears when she needed him the most. As time passed, the whispers grew louder. The house felt alive with echoes of the past, shadows creeping into every corner, taunting him with their presence. The children often spoke of seeing their mother in the glass fragments scattered across the floor, her face twisted in fear as if begging them to save her. The distorted reflections became a constant reminder of Linda's fate, an agonizing loop that haunted Dave day and night. "You'll be next," the voice echoed in his mind, a dark mantra that left him sleepless and paranoid. He could no longer tell where reality ended and the cursed mirror's influence began. In his desperation, he decided to gather the shards one last time, convinced that confronting the mirror's power might reveal the truth. He placed the pieces together, hoping to find some clue, some way to bring Linda back. But as he worked, the reflections twisted and warped, showing him horrific visions of what could happen next. His children were standing at the edge of a dark abyss, a figure waiting in the shadows, beckoning them closer. It was the old man, the same sinister smile spreading across his face as he reached out to them. "No!" Dave shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The glass exploded outward, shattering the fragile illusion of safety he had tried to maintain. He fell to the ground, the shards digging into his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear that consumed him. "Linda?" he cried, desperation clawing at his throat as he felt the shadows close in around him. The whispers grew louder, drowning out his voice, echoing through the empty halls of their home. "You'll be next. You'll be next. You'll be next." The mirror, though broken, had left an indelible mark on their lives. It was a curse that lingered, its darkness a shadow over their existence. And in the end, it left them with a haunting truth. Some reflections hold more than just an image. They hold the power to change everything, shattering lives and trapping souls in a perpetual nightmare. Story 3: The Forgotten Graveyard. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the small town as Jake approached the long-forgotten graveyard on the edge of town. It was Halloween night, and the air was thick with the scents of fallen leaves and the distant sound of laughter and music from Halloween parties. His friends, a motley crew of thrill-seekers, dared him to spend the night in the graveyard, and he couldn't resist the challenge. He had to prove he wasn't afraid. With a flashlight in hand and a sleeping bag slung over his shoulder, Jake stepped into the graveyard, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his feet echoing in the stillness. The old iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a patchwork of moss-covered tombstones, some leaning dangerously, others completely forgotten by time. An unsettling chill ran down his spine, but he squared his shoulders and ventured deeper. Knowing his friends were watching from the safety of their car, parked just outside the graveyard. "Just keep an eye on the time," Jake called out over his shoulder, attempting to sound brave. His friends chuckled, their laughter fading as he settled into the overgrown grass near a particularly ancient-looking gravestone. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the inscriptions that had long since faded. As the hours slipped away, Jake felt the weight of solitude settle heavily upon him. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. He glanced at his watch. It was nearing midnight, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Suddenly, Jake's flashlight caught something in the distance. A fresh grave, the mound of dirt still dark and rich, a stark contrast against the time-worn graves surrounding it. There was no headstone, no indication of who lay buried beneath. A shiver ran down his spine as he approached, curiosity overriding his caution. "Hey, you guys," he shouted toward his friends, hoping to get a reaction. "Check this out, we've got a fresh one." But his friends remained silent, perhaps too engrossed in their own nerves to respond. Kneeling beside the grave, Jake felt the ground beneath him pulse, as if it were alive. He brushed away a layer of dirt with his hand, and that's when he heard it, the soft, insistent murmurs coming from beneath the surface. "Free us," the voices urged, a chorus of desperate pleas that sent chills racing through Jake's body. His heart pounded in his chest, and he instinctively stepped back. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, shaking his head as if to clear his mind. His curiosity quickly turned to dread. "This isn't funny," he called out again, hoping to evoke a reaction from his friends. But the graveyard was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run, but a strange compulsion drew him closer to the grave. Against his better judgment, he grabbed the small shovel he had brought with him, its cold metal glinting in the moonlight. He hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder, but the whispering voices pulled him in like a moth to a flame. With each scoop of dirt, the pleas grew louder, more desperate. "Jake, stop," a voice cried out, not from the grave but from the air around him. He froze, the shovel hovering above the ground. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, echoing through the night. Panic surged through him, and he dug a little deeper, compelled to understand what lay beneath. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, a sound so horrific that it sent shockwaves through Jake's body. It was distant, yet close enough to feel like it was coming from inside his own mind. The ground beneath him began to shift, trembling as though something was awakening from the depths. "Stop! You need to stop!" the voices screamed, a cacophony of panic and urgency. The earth shifted again, as if warning him, urging him to abandon the grave. Terrified, he dropped the shovel and stumbled back, heart racing as the ground quaked beneath him. Breathless and panicked, Jake turned to run. But as he did, he felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him, watching, waiting. He could almost feel the presence of the souls beneath the earth, their restless energy wrapping around him like a shroud. "Free us!" they continued to whisper, their voices weaving into a chilling melody that echoed through the night. The fear coursed through his veins, his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out all rational thought. He sprinted back toward the entrance of the graveyard, desperate to escape the horrors he had unearthed. He stumbled out of the graveyard, collapsing against the rusted gate, gasping for air. His friends were still in the car, their faces pale and wide-eyed as they caught sight of his panic. "Jake, what happened?" one of them shouted, rushing to his side. But Jake could barely form words, his mind racing with images of the grave, the voices, and the ground trembling beneath him. There's something in there," he managed to gasp. "We need to get out of here." His friends exchanged nervous glances, hesitant to believe his wild claims. "Come on, man, it's just a graveyard," another friend scoffed, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "No, you don't understand," Jake shouted, urgency clawing at him. "It's not just dirt and graves, it's alive. They're trapped in there." Reluctantly, they climbed out of the car, curiosity piqued despite the fear that hung heavy in the air. They followed Jake back toward the graveyard, but as they stepped through the gate, the atmosphere changed. The air felt thicker, charged with a strange energy that prickled at their skin. "Where is it?" one of his friends asked, looking around nervously. "There," Jake pointed, his voice trembling as he gestured toward the fresh grave. But as they approached, an unsettling stillness fell over the group. The whispers that had haunted Jake earlier were now eerily quiet, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them. The grave looked untouched, the soil undisturbed, since he had fled. Jake's heart raced as he scanned the area, the panic creeping back into his chest. "It was right here," he insisted, pointing to the mound of earth that looked innocuous in the moonlight. "Maybe you just imagined it," another friend said, the skepticism evident in his tone. But Jake shook his head, a cold sweat coating his skin. "No, I heard them, I swear. They wanted me to free them." Just then, a loud crack echoed through the graveyard, startling everyone into silence. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the atmosphere thickened with a palpable sense of dread. Jake felt a pull, an urge to dig again, to confront whatever lay beneath, despite the fear clawing at him. Before he could think better of it, he grabbed the shovel once more, digging furiously at the grave, each scoop of dirt a battle against the unknown. His friends watched, torn between fear and concern, unsure whether to stop him or to support him. "Jake, don't!" one shouted, but he couldn't hear them over the roaring in his ears, the whispers growing louder once more. "Free us! Free us!" The voices wailed, a cacophony of sorrow and desperation that resonated deep within him. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath his feet, and Jake tumbled into a hole that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Panic surged as he landed hard, dirt raining down around him. As he scrambled to his feet, the ground began to shift once more, and he found himself in a dark, eerie space beneath the graveyard. "Jake!" his friends shouted from above, their voices distant and filled with dread. "What is happening?" Jake gasped, realizing he was surrounded by tombs and forgotten souls. The air was thick with despair, and the voices that once pleaded for freedom were now a chorus of anger and betrayal. "You disturbed our rest," they hissed, their forms flickering in and out of existence, pale and ghostly. Jake could feel their rage, their pain, and for the first time he understood the gravity of what he had done. "I'm sorry," he cried out, backing away as their figures loomed closer, shadows creeping toward him. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to help." But the voices only grew louder, drowning out his apologies, a tempest of anger that reverberated through the darkness. "You cannot help what you do not understand," they screamed, and in that moment, Jake realized that his meddling had awakened something far beyond his comprehension. Desperately, he looked for a way out, searching for an escape from the vengeful spirits that surrounded him. The tombs loomed like sentinels, each one a testament to the souls trapped beneath the earth, each one echoing with the cries of those who had been wronged. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance, a soft glow that seemed to beckon him. Without thinking, Jake sprinted toward it, the whispers fading into a chaotic din behind him. As he approached the light, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, a brief respite from the chaos. But as he reached the threshold, the ground beneath him began to quake violently. "You cannot leave," the spirits cried, their voices filled with rage and despair. "You awakened us, and now you must pay the price." In that moment of desperation, Jake remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him. Tales of how to communicate with spirits, how to offer peace. "I'm here to listen," he shouted, his voice rising above the din. "I want to understand. Just let me help you." The ground trembled, and for a moment the spirits paused, the anger in their voices subsiding. "Help us. Free us from this torment," they whispered, their tones shifting from rage to a mournful plea. "I will," Jake promised, feeling the weight of their sorrow bearing down on him. "I swear I'll find a way to help you." The light before him brightened, illuminating the dark space, and the spirits began to retreat, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. With each promise he made, the oppressive weight around him lessened, the anger dissipating like fog under the morning sun. As Jake continued to offer his pledges, the spirits grew calmer, their cries transforming into a haunting melody of hope. They began to show him visions, moments from their lives, the injustices they had faced, and the reasons for their unrest. Each story revealed a piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into their pain and suffering. "I understand now," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You deserve to be remembered. Your stories must be told." With each acknowledgement, he felt the ground beneath him shift, and the tombs began to glow with an ethereal light. "Thank you," the spirits whispered, their voices fading into a harmonious chorus of gratitude. As Jake stood amidst the light, he felt himself being pulled upward, the world around him blurring as he rose to the surface. He gasped as he emerged back into the graveyard, collapsing onto the ground as the moonlight bathed him in its glow. His friends rushed to his side, their faces etched with concern. "What happened?" one of them asked, panic in their eyes. Jake struggled to catch his breath, the weight of the experience crashing over him like a tidal wave. "They were trapped," he managed to say. I think I helped them." The graveyard felt different now, as though a heavy burden had been lifted. The air was lighter, and the oppressive silence had been replaced with a sense of peace. Jake looked toward the fresh grave, now devoid of its eerie presence, and felt a sense of closure. "We have to remember them," he said, determination flooding his veins. "We have to tell their stories, to honor them." His friends exchanged glances, a mix of awe and fear in their eyes, but Jake knew they understood. The spirits had been freed from their torment, their voices now a part of the night sky, woven into the very fabric of the graveyard. As they left the graveyard behind, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, bound not by fear, but by a profound understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of remembering those who came before. And in the stillness of the night, the forgotten graveyard stood as a testament to the stories that had been told, a place where the past and present intertwined, whispering secrets of those who would never be forgotten again. As the moon hung high in the night sky, casting a silvery glow over the forgotten graveyard, Jake felt an unease settling into his bones. The wind whispered through the ancient trees, the branches creaking like the forgotten spirits of those resting beneath the earth. After his harrowing encounter with the angry spirits, he had hoped to find solace in the quiet company of his friends, yet their laughter felt distant against the weight of the stories he had heard. Jake lingered a moment longer by the fresh grave, a gaping hole in the earth that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. The flowers his friends had placed there were wilting, their vibrant colors fading into the cold, hard soil. He felt a tug in his chest, a strange compulsion to lean closer and pay his respects. Kneeling by the grave, he placed a trembling hand on the earth, whispering a silent apology for the life that had been cut short. But just as he prepared to rise, a soft voice emerged from the shadows, barely audible yet piercing through the night like a siren's call. "I've been waiting for you." The words sent chills racing down his spine. Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned slowly, scanning the graveyard for any signs of life. There was none, just the silhouettes of gravestones standing like sentinels under the moonlight. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice wavering. Silence enveloped him, thick and suffocating. Then he heard it again, clearer this time, echoing from the depths of the grave. "I've been waiting for you." The voice was unmistakably his own, laced with a haunting familiarity that sent his mind spiraling. Fear washed over him like a tidal wave, and he stumbled backward, glancing around for his friends. But they were nowhere in sight, the distance between them now feeling like a chasm. Panicked, Jake turned to flee. Yet as he did, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight with an uncanny resemblance to him. It moved with a grace that mirrored his own, every twitch of his fingers and turn of his head perfectly synchronized. The only difference was the dark, hollow void where its eyes should have been, a gaping abyss that seemed to swallow the light around it. "Jake," it whispered, the word echoing in a tone that sent shivers racing through him. The creature grinned, a smile that was both familiar and alien. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet his feet felt rooted to the ground. Mesmerized by the apparition, he bolted, heart racing as he dashed through the graveyard, the cold air stinging his lungs. He could hear the figure behind him, its footsteps a perfect echo of his own. Panic surged, adrenaline coursing through his veins, propelling him forward as he veered between tombstones, desperate to escape this haunting reflection. "Where do you think you're going?" the figure taunted, its voice a twisted mimicry of his own. "You can't leave me behind, Jake. We're bound together now." The graveyard seemed to warp around him, the shadows elongating and twisting as if the very earth was conspiring against him. He sprinted toward the wrought iron gate, his breath coming in sharp gasps, but every time he glanced back, the figure was there, a phantom pursuing him with relentless intent. Jake stumbled, falling to the ground as he reached the gate, scrambling to his feet with a surge of determination. He pushed against the gate, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if it had been locked by an unseen force, trapping him inside this realm of the forgotten. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of the figure's footsteps drawing closer. "Don't you want to know the truth?" it hissed, voice dripping with a sinister charm. "What lies beneath? Who you really are? I'm you, Jake, the part of you that's been hidden away, the shadow you've tried to forget." "No," Jake screamed, shaking his head violently. "You're not me. You're a monster." "Am I?" The figure laughed, the sound echoing through the graveyard like a death knell. "Or am I the truth you've denied? We are one, Jake, and tonight you'll finally understand." Jake's world spun around him as he clawed at the gate, panic clawing at his insides. Just then, he caught sight of his friends in the distance, their figures silhouetted against the dim light. He screamed for help, his voice cracking as he pounded it against the iron bars. "Help! I need help!" But they didn't seem to hear him. Instead, they turned and walked away, their forms fading into the night, leaving him alone in the graveyard, surrounded by shadows. In that moment of despair, Jake turned back toward the figure, who now stood just a breath away, a smirk twisting its lips. "You see, they'll forget you too, just like everyone else, but I won't let you go that easily." With one final surge of adrenaline, Jake pushed against the gate, and this time, it swung open with a creak, revealing the path back to the outside world. He dashed through, his heart pounding wildly as he tore himself away from the graveyard, the feeling of the figure's cold presence lingering in his mind. As he reached the edge of the woods, he collapsed onto the grass, panting heavily, the night air thick with tension. The graveyard loomed behind him, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. He could still hear the echo of his own voice, calling from the grave. "I've been waiting for you." The next morning, his friends found him outside the graveyard, silent and staring blankly into the distance. No matter how much they called to him, he didn't respond. It was as if a part of him had been left behind, forever entangled with the spirits of the graveyard. Rumors began to spread through the town that anyone who spent the night there left a part of themselves behind, lost among the shadows of the forgotten. Jake became a ghost of his former self, an empty shell wandering through life, haunted by the echoes of the graveyard and the revelation of who he truly was. The shadows of the past clung to him, reminding him of the haunting truth that would never let him go. And as the days turned into weeks, he became another whisper in the night, a cautionary tale of what happens when you dare to confront the darkness that lies within. As the last rays of twilight surrendered to the creeping darkness, the air grew thick with anticipation, a tension that wrapped around the world like a shroud. Halloween night had arrived, and with it came a potent reminder that the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. Each story told tonight, each chilling tale shared among friends and strangers alike, had the power to awaken things best left forgotten: memories, fears, and the restless spirits that lingered in the shadows. The storyteller leaned closer to the flickering flames of the bonfire, his voice low and hushed, drawing in his listeners as if to ensnare them in the web of his words. "You see, each of these stories," he began, glancing around at the rapt faces illuminated by the firelight, "is not merely fiction. They are warnings, reminders that curiosity can lead us down paths we are not prepared to traverse." He recounted the tale of Jake, who dared to spend a night in the graveyard, only to discover that the spirits of the forgotten would not let him leave without a piece of himself. "Jake thought he was brave," the storyteller continued, his voice echoing with a chilling finality. "But bravery can quickly turn to horror when faced with the unknown. The shadows of the graveyard welcomed him, and now he wanders among them, lost to us all." He moved on to Linda, who thought an antique mirror could bring her family joy during their Halloween festivities. But the cursed mirror had a different agenda, one that reflected not just their past, but dark futures, distorting their reality until it trapped Linda within its glassy prison. She thought she could control it, he said, but in the end, it was she who was controlled, leaving her family haunted by her absence. Then there was Mark and his friends, who encountered the whispering shadows. They believed they were simply playing a game, pushing the limits of their courage. Yet, as the shadows closed in around them, Mark discovered too late that some games invite darkness that cannot be ignored. They thought it was just a dare, the storyteller warned, his tone growing somber. But those whispers are not just echoes of the past. They are warnings that reach out to the living, beckoning them closer. As the flames crackled and sparks danced into the air, the storyteller's voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. These stories remain unfinished, their endings open and lingering like the smoke from this fire. They remind us that this Halloween, with its secrets and shadows, could easily be your own. You might think you're safe, that you are merely an observer in these tales, but that is where the true danger lies. His gaze swept over the group, locking onto each pair of eyes, capturing their attention with an unyielding intensity. "Curiosity can lead you to dark places," he cautioned, "and once you step into that realm, there's no telling what you might invite in." A shiver ran through the crowd, an electric pulse of awareness that began to creep into their minds. The storyteller leaned back, letting the silence settle like a thick fog. "You've heard these stories, and by doing so, you've welcomed their essence into your world. You've invited something to follow you home, to whisper in the dark corners of your mind, waiting for the right moment to make itself known." The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the faces of those gathered, reflecting their unease. The storyteller's voice dropped to a hushed tone, a chilling breath against the night. Tonight, as you lay your head down to sleep, listen closely. You may hear the whispers of Jake, Linda, or Mark echoing through the night. They may call your name, just as they were called before. You've become a part of their tales, woven into the fabric of their existence. He leaned forward, his expression grave, yet laced with a twisted delight. So be wary as you navigate this Halloween. Each corner turned, each shadow encountered, may lead you closer to a fate similar to theirs. The darkness is alive, and it watches, it waits. As the fire began to dim, the storyteller leaned back, letting the silence envelop the group. The once lively laughter had transformed into murmurs of concern, and the thrill of Halloween faded, replaced by an awareness that their night was not just a celebration, but an invitation to a world where shadows lurked and whispers echoed. As they prepared to leave, the storyteller raised a hand in farewell, a knowing smile curling at the corners of his lips. Remember, my friends, the power of these stories lies not in their telling, but in your understanding of them. You are now part of the tapestry, a thread woven into the fabric of the unknown. Sleep well, and may the whispers be gentle tonight. With that, he extinguished the flame, plunging them into darkness, and the last words echoed in the night air, a chilling reminder of what lingered beyond the edges of their reality. The gathering dispersed, leaving only the shadows and the silence, as the night awaited its next story to unfold.